Slavery is a complex thing, and its effects are not as simple as they seem. The implications on culture, society, history, and economy go far beyond what we all have learned at school. But have you ever wondered, how were the lives of those slaves? Hello friends, well, if you often fantasize about the past and really want to know about the history of ancient civilizations, then you're at the right place. Welcome to Unthinkable Past, a channel better known for dishing up the outlandish ancient traditions of all times. Today we're going to ancient Egypt and check out the life of an Egyptian slave. So better buckle up and let's bench history together. Slavery has been a common practice among ancient civilizations. Ancient Egypt was no different and made use of slave labor as every other ancient culture did without regard to any particular ethnicity. The terminology used by the Egyptians referred to different classes of servitude over the course of dynastic history has somewhat complicated the ongoing studies about slavery in Pharaonic Egypt. And it's been impossible to identify the classes of slaves in ancient Egypt based solely on word usage. The Egyptian word interpreted as slave doesn't cleanly go with current vocabulary or customary work responsibilities. The terms servant, peasant, and slave can all refer to distinct roles in various contexts. Syllables bak and hem in Egyptian literature mean laborer or servant. Slave-like people are referred to as skoranks in some Egyptian languages, which means bound for life. You guys got it? Slavery existed in ancient Egypt at least since the Old Kingdom period and kept evolving all the way to the New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom had fewer slaves serving the populace. However, it surged during the New Kingdom as a result of military campaigns and warfare with neighboring countries. So you see, forced labor and servitude can be found throughout ancient Egypt. Egyptians actually craved sovereignty over their kingdoms and were willing to alter political and social values in order to improve their economic status. Slavery here benefited ancient Egypt not only economically but also made it easier to maintain power and stability in the kingdoms. Let's see some reasons for enslavement. In ancient Egypt, people could be enslaved if they owed money or were desperate to escape their terrible life of poverty. For these folks, engaging in slavery by contract was an option to repay their debts. In fact, in some cases, enslavement provided people with economic security that for them was worth giving up their freedom. Enslavement was also used as a kind of punishment for some people who were found guilty for crime. The convicted offenders, particularly strong males, were forced into slavery by the authorities. Well, people from all social classes in ancient Egypt could be subjected to a few seemingly distinct sorts of slavery. There were three common types of enslavement back then, starting with Chattel enslavement. Those subjected to Chattel slavery were mostly prisoners of war who had been brought from different cities and countries and were sold as slaves. They were generally deemed as a royal resource. As such, the pharaoh could do with them as he wished. He may assign them to work in various colonies, give them to temples, offer them as gifts to specific individuals, or even as loot to soldiers. To your interest, some of these Chattel slaves might have started off their lives as free individuals. They were subsequently taken into slavery after being found guilty of a crime that cost them their freedom. Others in Chattel captivity, on the other hand, were born into it. Next is bonded labor. The ancient Egyptians could sell themselves and their children into slavery as a sort of bonded labor. Self-sale into servitude was not necessarily a voluntary choice, but rather the outcome of those who were unable to pay off their debts, as mentioned earlier. The debtor would also have to give up all those owed. Peasants, on the other hand, could even sell themselves into slavery in exchange for food or shelter. It was also a common practice for enslaved people to be purchased outside of Egypt and brought into the country to perform labor. Forced labor was another form of enslavement in ancient Egypt. Various departments of the ancient Egyptian government had the authority to conscript laborers from the broader Egyptian populace to serve in various state projects. Military expeditions, mining and quarrying, and state construction projects were among the tasks undertaken. Forced laborers were paid a wage that varied according to their skill level. Despite not having any choice in whether they worked or not, forced laborers were not owned by individuals like other groups of enslaved peoples. Instead, their labor was viewed as their duty to the state. In fact, forced labor was a form of taxation by government officials. Another weird type of slavery in ancient Egypt granted captives the promise of an afterlife if they faithfully served the lords for a whole lifetime. Ushabtis were small figures that were designed to be placed in the master's tomb. These figures were symbolic of a slave's loyalty and bond to their master. Time to see what life would have been like for Egyptian slaves. Obviously, some did live in terrible conditions. but for the most part, it is thought that slaves were treated pretty well in ancient Egypt. For a very poor person, the idea of having a place to live and guaranteed meals would have been appealing. Some slaves may have even had fair working hours and lived in better conditions, especially since they didn't have to pay taxes. Slaves working for a royal family, often dubbed king slaves, had it even better. They were generally more educated than other slaves and were even more respected than Egyptians with a high social standing. And then there were field or plantation slaves who lived and worked on the plantations. Most of these plantations had 50 or fewer slaves. However, the larger plantations had hundreds. Toiled in shifts of up to 18 hours a day during harvest season, the life of slaves on the fields was all about working from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week and having food that was even sometimes unfit for an animal to consume. In other words, the diet mostly offered to the field slaves was barely adequate to meet the demands of their heavy workload. Many slaves who worked for template estates lived under punitive conditions, but the average ancient Egyptian household slave led a life closer to that of a serf. They were capable of negotiating deals and owning personal property. Chattel and debt slaves, on the other hand, were most likely fed but not paid. However, some less fortunate slaves were sent to work in the gold and copper mines in North Africa's deserts. They often died of thirst or heat exhaustion. As a matter of fact, Egyptian slaves were not even bound to the land. The owners might employ the slave in a variety of occupations. Slaves could contribute to the region's and community's production. The slaves were typically men, but women and families might be compelled to work in the owner's household. Here, the fluidity of a slave's vocation doesn't imply freedom. And due to a paucity of sources and data from the ancient historical period, it is difficult to use the word free to define slaves' political or social independence. A brief look now at their lodging and wardrobe. Slaves were mostly housed in tiny shacks with dirt floors and thatched roofs having little or even no furnishings. Although those mud brick houses were relatively cheap to make, they were not very strong and began to crumble after a few years. They used to don light linen clothing. Their children didn't wear clothes until they were about 6 years old. Men often used wraparound skirts tied at the waist with a belt, and women wore full-length straight dresses with 1 or 2 shoulder straps. The slaves went barefoot most of the time, wore sandals for special occasions or if their feet were likely to get hurt in a job. Getting to some of their leisure pastimes and religious beliefs, slaves spent their limited leisure time if they could get any visiting friends and family nearby, sharing stories and playing music when they could. These slaves, though not allowed in temples, tried to stick to their religious beliefs for internal peace and inspiration. Though slavery was a hard and often cruel life, their religious beliefs reminded them that their lives had some meaning as well as dignity and helped them resist the degradation of bondage. As for the other social affairs, the slaves could even get married to those who were not slaves, but the free spouse had to buy the freedom of the other. However, slaves were not mummified after death and were buried somewhere in the open desert. Let's not forget the punishments and mistreatment. The slaves were expected to obey their masters in any case, and the masters had complete control over a slave's life, and they often treated them as property. The owners were allowed to act as dictators since slaves had no rights, and those who disobeyed or objected, even in minor ways, were punished severely or auctioned. To tell you the truth, killing a slave was not even considered a felony, and there was little interest in prosecuting for the mistreatment of these slaves, as it was a common practice. Finally, manumission or freeing a slave was seemingly not very common, but if they were freed, former slaves were not stigmatized. Instead, they were considered part of the general free population. Historians have studied situations where this could be a possibility, but it's still uncertain if independence from slavery was even possible. Well, there you have it. We hope you liked this video. If you did, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel without any delays. Make sure to turn on the post notifications and also let us know in the comments section about your views on the life of an Egyptian slave. Until the next time we meet, continue learning and stay healthy. Goodbye.